I delivered a $50,000 dining table to wealthy homeowners, then they accused me of stealing and called the cops on me. When I finally explained, they laughed and said, "You're a craftsman? More like a thief trying to get away with it." I just stood there. That was 2 months ago. Yesterday, their son posted a video of his parents being arrested on Facebook. Rich homeowners treated me like a thief, not knowing I hand-carved their $50,000 dining table. I'd spent 8 months carving their dining set from a single black walnut tree. Every joint hand-cut, every surface personally finished with 16 coats of oil I'd mixed myself. When the delivery company said they were short-staffed and asked if I wanted to ride along to see my masterpiece installed, I threw on an old t-shirt and work pants, figuring it'd be cool to help carry it in and watch their reaction. I had no idea the homeowners were about to terrorize me, because they had no idea I'd spent the last 2,000 hours creating the furniture they'd dropped 50 grand on. The husband Brian opened the door and immediately stepped outside, closing it behind him like I might rush past him. "We weren't expecting anyone this early," he said, looking at my unmarked truck with suspicion. "Let me see your work order and ID before you bring anything near my property." When I showed him the paperwork, he took photos of everything including my driver's license, then called someone to verify while making me stand on the porch. My chest tightened, but I stayed quiet, wanting to see their genuine reaction when they finally saw the pieces, even if it meant enduring their suspicion first. His wife Grace came out and whispered something to Brian, who nodded and announced they'd need to check the truck before I unloaded anything. They walked around it 3 times, Brian getting on his knees to look underneath. Grace took photos of my license plate and started texting rapidly. When I opened the truck to show them their furniture, Brian immediately accused me of trying to pull a switch. "This isn't what we ordered," he said without even unwrapping it. "You're probably delivering some knockoff." The accusation stung because every detail under those blankets was perfect, down to the hand-rubbed finish I'd spent weeks perfecting. Grace started filming me, narrating evidence in case anything went missing. As I carried the first chair, Brian followed so closely he kept stepping on my heels. "I know what you're doing," he said, casing the place. His proximity made me stumble, nearly dropping the chair I'd spent 3 weeks carving, which made him grab it from the other side like I was about to run. The near drop made Grace panic and call their neighbor Matt, who arrived with a baseball bat. "These people always come back to rob you," Matt announced, blocking the doorway while I tried to carry furniture past him. Having 3 people surrounding me while I handled my own work made my hands shake with frustration. When I needed to move their existing table, Brian grabbed my wrist hard the second I touched it. "That's a family heirloom," he shouted, even though the Pottery Barn label was visible underneath. The grab made me reflexively pull back, which Grace interpreted as aggressive behavior. She immediately called 911, saying I was getting physical with her husband. While she was on the phone, Matt decided I'd been inside too long and started going through the truck himself, pulling out my personal tools. "Burglary equipment," he announced, holding up my hand chisels. He brought tools to break in later. Brian used this as justification to start patting my pockets, looking for what he assumed I'd stolen while inside. The physical search made me step back, which Brian interpreted as trying to flee. He grabbed my shoulder, and Matt moved to block my escape route to the truck. "He's trying to run," Grace told the 911 dispatcher. "The delivery man is acting violent and attempting to flee. Please hurry." I tried to explain, but Brian found my leather work apron in my pocket with my name embroidered on it. "Robert Miller, Master Craftsman," he read mockingly. "This guy stole the real craftsman's apron. Identity theft on top of everything else." He threw it on the ground and stepped on it, grinding dirt into the leather I'd worn for 15 years. Grace noticed I'd been positioning each chair at specific angles and accused me of memorizing their layout. She started moving all the furniture I'd placed, which made me involuntarily reach out to stop her from scratching the finish against the wall. Matt interpreted this as assault and pinned my arms behind my back while Brian called the furniture company directly. "I want to speak to the actual craftsman right now," Brian demanded on speakerphone. "Some criminal is here impersonating him, even stole his apron." The owner started laughing. "Robert's actually doing the delivery himself today. He wanted to see your reaction to the pieces. Tall guy, brown hair, probably wearing his old Marines shirt." "No," Brian insisted, looking at me with disgust. "This is some Mexican thug with prison tattoos trying to rob us." "Put me on video," the owner said. When Brian switched to video call, the owner's face appeared on screen. "Robert, is that you they're restraining?" Brian spun the phone to show me pinned against the wall by Matt, and the owner exploded. "What the hell are you doing? That's Robert Miller. He spent 8 months building your furniture. Let him go immediately." Brian's face drained of color as he looked from the phone to me, then at the apron he'd ground into the dirt with my name clearly embroidered on it. The sound of sirens made everyone freeze, and within seconds 2 cops walked through the still open front door with their hands hovering near their weapons. Grace immediately started sobbing and pointing at me while I was still pinned against the wall by Matt. My arms twisted up behind my back so hard that my shoulders felt like they were about to pop out. "He threatened us in our own home," she cried to the officers while Brian held up my dirty work apron like it was evidence of some major crime. The senior cop, a woman with detective stripes on her uniform, noticed Brian's phone was still showing Thomas's face on the video call, and Thomas was shouting loud enough for everyone to hear that I was the actual craftsman who'd built their furniture. Detective Sarah Walsh, according to her name tag, looked from the phone to me pinned against the wall and ordered Matt to let me go immediately. Matt hesitated until she took a step toward him. Then he released my arms and I had to catch myself against the wall because my legs had gone numb from the position he'd held me in. Sarah took Brian's phone and started talking to Thomas directly, while her partner kept everyone else in place, and I watched her expression change from suspicious to concerned as Thomas explained the whole situation. Brian tried to jump in and insist I'd been aggressive and threatening them, but Thomas was already pulling up emails on his computer and sending them to Sarah's phone, including my whole portfolio, my business license, and time-stamped photos of me working on every single piece of their furniture over the past 8 months. Sarah's partner had Grace play back her 911 call on speaker, and everyone could hear her claiming I was violent and trying to flee when the video from Brian's own security cameras would show I hadn't done anything except try to deliver furniture. Matt quietly set his baseball bat down behind a plant and started edging toward the door, but Sarah told him to stay put while she sorted everything out. She turned to me and asked if I wanted to press charges for false imprisonment, assault, and defamation. Listing each potential charge garage while Brian and Grace stood frozen in their marble foyer like they couldn't believe this was happening. Movement on the staircase caught my eye, and I saw their teenage son Marcus holding up his phone, recording everything with a look of complete disgust aimed at his parents, not at me. My hands were still shaking from the adrenaline, and my shoulders were screaming from how Matt had wrenched them, but I forced myself to speak calmly and told Sarah I just wanted to finish the delivery I'd started. Sarah said we could discuss charges later and suggested I go ahead and properly position the furniture while she and her partner supervised. So I started explaining the grain patterns and joinery techniques as I carefully placed each chair at the exact angle to catch the light through their windows. Each chair had taken me 3 weeks to carve, with every spindle shaped by hand, and each table leg contained 40 hand-cut dovetails that would last centuries. Plus, the finish had required 16 coats of oil applied over 2 months with sanding between each coat. Marcus came down the stairs and started asking real questions about how I'd book-matched the wood grain and why I'd chosen specific joint techniques, showing genuine interest while his parents watched in growing horror as they realized who they'd just assaulted. The sound of another vehicle pulling up made everyone turn, and Thomas walked in 40 minutes after leaving his workshop, carrying a banker's box full of documentation including printed emails where Brian had specifically requested that I personally oversee the installation. He also had his laptop with security footage from our workshop showing me working on every piece, all dated and time-stamped over the past 8 months, which he set up on their kitchen counter and started playing for Sarah. Grace tried to slip away upstairs, but Sarah asked her to remain present while they reviewed everything, and I could see Grace's face going pale as she realized how much trouble they were in. Brian suddenly switched tactics and started calling this all a big misunderstanding, pulling out his checkbook and offering to pay extra for the inconvenience if we could all just forget this happened and move on. Thomas's face went red, and he told Brian the contract was now void due to assault on the craftsman, and we'd be removing every piece of furniture immediately, which meant they'd waited 8 months for nothing, and no other high-end craftsman would touch their commission once word spread through the industry. I wonder what's really going through Brian and Grace's minds right now. They spent $50,000 on furniture but treated the person delivering it like a criminal without even looking at what was in the truck. The color drained from Brian's face as he processed what Thomas was saying, and he started to argue, but Thomas was already on the phone with our workshop sending guys with the truck to collect everything. I started wrapping the first chair in blankets while Grace frantically called their interior designer trying to get her to intervene, but when the designer heard what happened over the speakerphone, she immediately said she was terminating their contract and wouldn't work with people who treated craftsmen this way. Marcus helped me carry one of the chairs out to the truck, whispering an apology for his parents and asking if I ever took apprentices because he wanted to learn real craftsmanship. The front door opened again, and Matt's wife Linda walked in, having seen the police cars from their house, and when Sarah explained what had happened, Linda turned on Matt with more fury than I'd seen all day. She grabbed the baseball bat he'd tried to hide and waved it in his face while yelling about how he'd brought a weapon to threaten a delivery man, making him apologize to me directly while Brian and Grace watched their social standing with their neighbors crumble in real time. Sarah pulled up something on her patrol car's computer and showed me that Brian had 3 previous harassment complaints from service workers, including a plumber, an electrician, and a landscaper, though none had pursued charges. She explained that with Marcus's video, the 911 recording, and the false claims they'd made, criminal charges for false reporting and assault were definitely viable if I wanted to pursue them. Thomas was already on the phone with our company lawyer discussing options, while Brian and Grace stood in their own foyer looking smaller and smaller as their expensive house felt more and more like a crime scene. 2 hours passed while the movers loaded my furniture back into the truck, and I spotted my leather apron crumpled on the floor where Brian had ground it into the dirt. The 15-year-old leather was torn across the chest where he'd stepped on it, and the oil from his shoe had left a permanent black stain across my grandfather's initials that he'd tooled into it when I started my apprenticeship. Marcus picked it up and held it toward the light, taking photos with his phone while explaining he'd already posted the whole incident online with the caption about his parents assaulting a Marine veteran craftsman. Grace grabbed his phone and her face went white when she saw the post already had 800 shares in their Westchester community. Brian's phone started buzzing non-stop with text alerts and calls, the country club president's name flashing on the screen, asking about disturbing footage circulating among members. His law firm partners were texting frantically about protecting the firm's reputation and whether this would affect the Henderson Foundation charity gala next month. Grace started crying actual tears as she scrolled through comments from their friends expressing shock and disappointment, watching their 20 years of careful social positioning crumble in real time. The next morning, I walked into our workshop to find Thomas already there with a woman in a sharp suit who introduced herself as Patricia Kim, our company's lawyer who'd driven up from the city after Thomas called her at midnight. The dining set sat in our showroom looking perfect but somehow wrong now, like evidence from a crime scene rather than the masterpiece I'd spent 8 months creating. Patricia spread papers across my workbench explaining we had grounds for assault, false imprisonment, defamation, and civil rights violations based on the racial profiling, especially with Marcus's video showing everything. She'd already filed preservation orders for the 911 call and any security footage from the Henderson property before they could delete anything. Around noon, Marcus walked through our door alone, explaining he'd taken an Uber without telling his parents because he had something we needed to see. He pulled out his phone and showed us additional footage from their home security system that he'd downloaded before his parents thought to delete it. Crystal clear video of his father going through my pockets while I tried to pull away. The footage also captured his mother's performance for the 911 operator, dramatically gesturing and fake crying while I stood perfectly still with my hands visible, and Matt held me against the wall. Marcus said he was 18 and willing to testify because this wasn't the first time his parents had treated workers like criminals, just the first time they'd been caught on camera. That afternoon, I sat alone in the workshop holding the ruined apron and remembering my grandfather teaching me to cut dovetail joints in his garage, the smell of sawdust and machine oil filling the space while he guided my hands. He'd given me this apron the day I started my apprenticeship, hand-stitching my name himself, even though his arthritis made it painful, telling me a craftsman's apron tells his story through every stain and tear. Thomas found me there and sat on the bench beside me, sharing how customers used to follow him around his own shop when he first opened, assuming an Asian guy couldn't possibly own a high-end furniture store. We sat there in silence for a while, both understanding that some violations cut deeper than false accusations, that they'd attacked not just us, but everything we'd built with our hands. 3 days later, Brian showed up at our workshop with 3 lawyers in expensive suits, offering $200,000 to sign a non-disclosure agreement and make everything disappear. Thomas had his phone recording in his pocket while Brian essentially admitted to the assault, saying things like unfortunate misunderstanding and regrettable physical contact while trying to frame it as a simple mix-up. When we refused the money, Brian's tone changed completely, and he threatened to use his connections to destroy our business, saying he knew judges and could tie us up in lawsuits for years. What he didn't know was Patricia was recording everything from our break room next door, getting every threat and admission on tape through the thin wall. By then, Marcus's video had exploded to 2 million views, and reporters were calling our workshop constantly for statements about the Westchester Craftsman assault, as social media had named it. The comments section became a collection point for service workers sharing their own Henderson horror stories, with restaurant servers describing how Grace would claim to find hair in food she'd already eaten to avoid paying. 3 former housekeepers reached out to Patricia privately with recordings they'd secretly made of Grace, using racial slurs while accusing them of stealing jewelry that Grace later found in her own drawer. One had even filed a police report 2 years ago, but it had been dismissed without investigation, which Patricia immediately flagged for the district attorney's office. Sarah called me that evening to say the DA had reviewed everything and approved charges for false imprisonment, simple assault, and filing a false police report against both Brian and Grace. They would need to turn themselves in within 24 hours for booking and fingerprinting, though Sarah mentioned they'd probably get released immediately on their own recognizance given Brian's connections. She also mentioned Internal Affairs had opened an investigation into why previous complaints against the Hendersons hadn't been pursued, with 3 officers already under review for possibly giving the wealthy couple special treatment. The next morning, Linda Rodriguez knocked on our workshop door carrying Matt's baseball bat, asking if she could watch me destroy it as what she called a symbolic gesture of her disgust with her husband's behavior. She revealed Matt had been spending time at Brian's golf club, where a group of them sat around drinking and bragging about keeping those people out of their neighborhood through intimidation. She was filing for separation unless Matt agreed to therapy, and completely cut ties with Brian's toxic influence that had turned her husband into someone she didn't recognize anymore. 2 days later, Grace appeared on the local morning news trying to do damage control, but when the interviewer asked why she felt the need to film me, she accidentally admitted she had a whole system for recording all service workers who entered their home. The interviewer's face changed as Grace explained her security protocol of secretly recording anyone who did work in their house, not realizing she'd just admitted to illegal recording in New York's 2-party consent law. The interview got worse when Grace tried to justify the recordings by saying you never know what these people might do, and the interviewer had to actually stop her mid-sentence to point out she was making things worse. A week later, I sat in the packed courtroom watching Brian and Grace stand before the judge for their arraignment. Their lawyer argued this was all a misunderstanding, but the judge watched the body cam footage right there in court. The judge's face got harder with each minute of video until he set bail at $50,000 each. Service workers filled every seat behind me and local news cameras lined the walls. Brian kept turning around to look at all the people who'd come to support me. Grace's hands shook as she entered her not guilty plea. Outside the courthouse, Marcus stood next to me instead of with his parents, which made everyone stare. Brian tried to walk over to his son, but 2 courthouse guards stepped between them immediately. Marcus pulled out his phone and showed me years of videos he'd secretly recorded of his parents treating workers badly. He said he'd been waiting for someone to finally stand up to them, and he wanted to testify for the prosecution. That evening, I was trying to focus on sanding a new table leg when my phone rang with a blocked number. The way Grace accidentally admitted to illegally recording service workers on live TV makes me wonder if she even realizes how deep this hole really is that they've dug for themselves. A restaurant owner from Manhattan had seen the viral videos and wanted to commission a complete dining room set for his new location. He offered 20% above my normal rate specifically because he wanted to support what I'd been through. Thomas called it the justice dividend when good people step up to help. 2 weeks after the incident, I couldn't stop jumping every time someone walked into the workshop. My hands would start shaking whenever I heard footsteps behind me, even though I knew I was safe. The trauma counselor Patricia recommended said this was normal after being assaulted and falsely accused. Thomas installed 6 new security cameras and made a rule that 2 people had to be present for all deliveries now. Brian's law firm announced he was taking indefinite leave while the charges were pending. Former colleagues started calling reporters saying major clients had threatened to pull their business if Brian stayed. Grace lost all 3 of her charity board positions within 48 hours. Their country club sent a letter revoking their membership for conduct unbecoming of members. 3 weeks after everything happened, Marcus called me with something he'd found in his dad's home office files. He'd discovered 12 different lawsuits his parents had filed against contractors over the past 10 years. Every single case involved accusations of theft or damage that were never proven in court. Each one had been settled with the contractor paying money and signing an NDA to make it go away. Patricia said this looked like a pattern of extortion and fraud that could lead to federal charges. One of those contractors named James reached out after his NDA expired last month. He told me the Hendersons had accused him of stealing Grace's jewelry during a bathroom renovation 5 years ago. The jewelry mysteriously appeared in their safe deposit box after he paid them $30,000 to avoid criminal charges. His construction business went under because word spread about the theft accusation, even though it was never true. I met James and 3 other victims at Patricia's office the next week to share our stories. An elderly gardener named Eduardo still had nightmares about Brian accusing him of assault for refusing unpaid overtime. A house painter lost his business license after Grace claimed he'd exposed exposed himself to her. A pool cleaner had to move out of state after Matt helped Brian rough him up over missing tools that Brian had actually moved himself. Every story was the same pattern of false accusations against immigrant and minority workers. Patricia filed an amended lawsuit the next morning, adding RICO racketeering charges against the Hendersons. The filing showed evidence from all 12 victims and asked for $3.2 million in damages. Brian's former law firm immediately announced they were investigating whether he'd used company resources for the extortion scheme. The state bar also opened an ethics investigation that could end his legal career permanently. 1 month after the original incident, Grace tried to drive to their Hamptons house, but reporters were already waiting there. She panicked and backed into another car while trying to leave the parking lot. The police gave her a sobriety test, which she failed with a blood alcohol level twice the legal limit. Violating her bail conditions by leaving the county plus the DUI meant she spent the whole weekend in jail. Her mugshot went viral within hours with the hashtag Karma4Karens trending nationally. 2 days later, Marcus showed up at the workshop carrying a backpack and asked if he could help with anything. Thomas looked surprised, but I grabbed some sandpaper and showed him how to work with the grain on a practice piece of oak. His hands shook at first, but after an hour he'd found a rhythm, working the wood like he was trying to sand away something deeper than splinters. He mentioned his sister Emma kept texting from boarding school, begging to come home for Thanksgiving, but their parents wouldn't let her because it would look weak during the legal proceedings. He pulled up her messages on his phone, showing dozens of texts about how scared and alone she felt, how the other kids knew about the arrest and kept asking questions. Marcus had already contacted a family lawyer about getting guardianship once he turned 18 in 3 months, collecting every text and email where his parents prioritized their image over their kids' well-being. The next morning, Thomas's phone rang during our coffee break, and Brian's lawyer's voice filled the workshop on speaker, offering $500,000 to settle all civil claims if we dropped support for the criminal charges. Thomas told him we weren't interested in blood money, and the lawyer got flustered, accidentally mentioning that the IRS had frozen several of Brian's accounts while investigating unreported income from what he called consulting fees, but what sounded like extortion payments from other contractors. The lawyer hung up quickly after realizing what he'd revealed, but Thomas immediately called our attorney Patricia to share the information. That evening, a man knocked on my apartment door claiming to be a private investigator Brian had hired to dig up dirt on me. Instead of threats, though, he handed me a flash drive and said Brian had been hiding millions in offshore accounts that he'd discovered while investigating me, and now he wanted to turn whistleblower for immunity. The drive contained bank statements from accounts in the Cayman Islands showing regular deposits matching the amounts contractors had reported paying Brian over the years. Patricia met with him the next morning and started working with the FBI to verify the financial records, while the investigator provided detailed testimony about Brian's instructions to find anything that could discredit me. 3 nights later, I woke up to my neighbor pounding on my door saying someone had spray painted my truck. The same racial slurs Brian had used during the incident covered both sides, along with threats to leave town, the paint still dripping when I got outside. Security footage from the building across the street showed a figure in a hoodie, but the build and walk matched Brian perfectly, despite his attempt to hide his face. Sarah arrived within minutes and called the prosecutor immediately since this violated every condition of Brian's bail, and by noon, an emergency hearing was scheduled. The judge watched the security footage 3 times, comparing it to Brian's booking video, then revoked his bail and ordered him into custody immediately. Brian's lawyer argued it could have been anyone, but the judge pointed out the specific phrases matched Brian's recorded statements exactly, and the timing coincided with Brian's ankle monitor showing him leaving his house at 2 a.m. 6 weeks after the original incident, Grace showed up at the workshop drunk and pounding on the door, mascara running down her face as she alternated between screaming threats and sobbing apologies. Thomas quietly called 911 while I kept her talking through the door, recording everything on my phone as she admitted Brian made her go along with everything, threatening divorce and taking the kids if she didn't support his version of events. She kept saying she never wanted any of this, that Brian had convinced her I was dangerous, that he'd shown her fake articles about crimes committed by people who looked like me. Sarah arrived and arrested her for violating the restraining order we'd obtained after the truck incident, and Grace didn't resist, just kept crying about how Brian had ruined everything. The next morning, FBI agents surrounded the Henderson house with a warrant based on the tax fraud investigation and the financial records from the whistleblower. Marcus live-streamed from his friend's house across the street as agents carried out computers, file boxes, and even paintings that apparently hid safes behind them. Among the seized items were recordings Brian had made of planning sessions with other wealthy homeowners about coordinating their contractor extortion scheme, apparently keeping them as insurance in case anyone turned on him. The recordings included detailed discussions about targeting minority-owned businesses, specifically because they'd be less likely to fight back or be believed if they complained. Linda filed for divorce from Matt that same week and brought us security camera footage from their home showing Brian teaching Matt and other golf club members what he called proper handling techniques for minority workers. The footage showed Brian demonstrating how to physically intimidate workers while staying just within legal boundaries, using Matt as a practice partner while others took notes. Linda said she'd been recording everything for months after suspecting Matt was involved in something illegal, and now she wanted to help expose what she called a organized discrimination ring operating through the country club. The footage became key evidence in a federal investigation into systematic discrimination in Westchester's wealthy neighborhoods. Emma returned from boarding school the following week with Grace's sister, who'd filed for emergency custody of both kids. At 16, Emma was old enough to testify about years of emotional abuse, describing how her parents used her as a prop at charity events while ignoring her actual needs, forcing her to lie about their home life to maintain their reputation. She supported every claim Marcus had made and asked to speak at the trial about the toxic environment where image mattered more than truth, and her parents' racism had infected every aspect of their lives. During this chaos, I started working on my first new commission since the incident, a rocking chair for the restaurant owner's new baby. The wood felt different in my hands, like I was reclaiming something Brian had tried to steal, each cut deliberate and healing. Marcus working in the workshop while his sister texts desperately from boarding school really shows what's happening behind their perfect family image. These kids are dealing with so much more than just their parents' crimes right now. Marcus helped with the sanding, his technique improving daily, and I realized I'd become the mentor he desperately needed while his father was too busy building his criminal empire to notice his son. 2 months after the original incident, we sat in the preliminary hearing as Brian's lawyer submitted evidence documents to argue for reduced charges. He'd forgotten to redact one section that referenced Brian's membership in something called the Heritage Business Alliance, which Patricia immediately researched on her laptop. The organization's website, which they'd tried to scrub, but the Internet Archive preserved, explicitly stated their mission to preserve traditional business ownership through strategic economic pressure on non-traditional operators. The revelation triggered an immediate federal hate crime investigation, with the prosecutor announcing they'd be adding charges that could add decades to Brian's sentence. Patricia got a package 2 days later with no return address, just a plain USB drive wrapped in newspaper. She plugged it into her laptop in the courthouse conference room, and her eyes went wide as Brian's voice filled the room, recorded in his home office talking to other club members about keeping the neighborhood clean of what he called undesirable workers. The recordings went back months. Marcus had been secretly recording his dad whenever Brian held those late-night meetings in the study, and now Patricia had over 40 hours of Brian bragging about running minority contractors out of business through false accusations. The judge immediately ruled the recordings admissible since Marcus had legal access to those spaces as a resident of the house. Grace's custody hearing happened the next week, and her own sister Catherine took the stand, pulling out her phone to show text messages where Grace admitted being high on pills during my confrontation. Catherine's hands shook as she read Grace's texts about mixing Xanax with wine that morning, then driving to court appearances while barely able to stand straight. The prosecutor added driving under the influence charges on top of everything else, and Child Services moved to permanently remove custody based on the drug evidence. I drove to the cemetery 3 days later with my ruined apron in a plastic bag, kneeling at my grandfather's headstone and laying the dirty leather across the grass. I told him about the fight, about standing up like he taught me. When an old woman at the next grave walked over and said her husband Eduardo was a plumber Brian destroyed 15 years ago with false theft accusations. Eduardo had lost his business, his reputation, then had a heart attack from the stress, and died before he could clear his name, leaving her with nothing but debt and grief. The country club launched their own investigation after the federal charges hit the news, and their lawyers found Brian had been collecting monthly payments from 17 other members for what he called neighborhood security monitoring. The club's accountant discovered $50,000 in undocumented cash payments over 3 years, all labeled as donations, but actually bribes to target specific minority-owned businesses in the area. Federal prosecutors immediately added RICO charges since the club's board knew about the scheme and took a cut of the money to look the other way. 10 weeks after everything started, Marcus filed paperwork to legally change his last name to Park, his maternal grandmother's maiden name from Korea. He used money from his trust fund that Brian couldn't touch to create a scholarship for minority craftspeople, and the first check went to Eduardo's grandson who wanted to learn carpentry. Marcus sent me a photo of them at the technical school, both wearing work aprons. Eduardo's grandson holding the scholarship certificate with tears running down his face. Brian tried to hang himself in his cell using torn bed sheets, but guards found him after only 2 minutes when his cellmate started yelling for help. His lawyer tried to argue for reduced charges based on mental distress, but Patricia showed the judge Brian's pattern of manipulation going back 20 years in court records. The judge denied the motion and added that using suicide as a legal tactic showed Brian still refused to take responsibility for destroying lives. Thomas and I sat in front of the state commission 6 days later. Our testimony broadcast live as we described not just our case, but the pattern we'd discovered. The commission had testimonies from 43 other contractors, all with similar stories of false accusations from wealthy clients, most never reported because they couldn't afford lawyers. The proposed legislation would triple penalties for false accusations against service workers and require automatic investigation when someone filed more than 2 complaints in a year. Grace's mother Helen flew in from Florida and held a press conference on the courthouse steps, holding up childhood photos of Grace with their family's black housekeeper, Marie. Helen's voice broke as she apologized to every victim, saying she'd raised Grace to respect everyone, but somewhere her daughter had turned into a monster she didn't recognize. She showed a photo of 5-year-old Grace on Marie's lap at Christmas, then another of teenage Grace refusing to attend Marie's funeral because she had a spa appointment. The prosecutor got security footage from the golf club the next morning, showing Brian at the bar discussing his backup plan with 3 other members. The video clearly captured Brian saying he'd plant cocaine in my truck if I didn't take the settlement, even showing him pulling out a bag of white powder from his golf bag. The other 3 men nodded and offered to be witnesses that they saw me with drugs, and now all 3 faced conspiracy charges alongside Brian. 3 months after that first terrible morning, the IRS seized every asset Brian and Grace owned after finding they'd hidden income for over a decade. Their $7 million house went into foreclosure within a week. Both Mercedes were repossessed from the country club parking lot, and Grace had to take the bus to her court appearances. Other passengers recognized her from the news and would move away, leaving her sitting alone in the back, which Patricia said hurt Grace more than any potential jail time would. The pre-trial stuff started 3 weeks later when Brian's law firm suddenly decided they wanted nothing to do with him. His partners sent over boxes of emails where Brian had used company computers to look up every service worker who'd ever come to his house, running background checks and credit reports without permission. The prosecutor showed me 17 sworn statements from former partners describing how Brian would make racist jokes during meetings, and they'd all just sit there quietly because he brought in the biggest clients. They found emails where he'd coached other lawyers on how to scare immigrant workers into accepting lowball settlements by threatening to call immigration even when the workers were citizens. The firm's IT department handed over chat logs where Brian bragged about making a plumber cry by following him to his truck and taking photos of his license plate while telling him he'd make sure the guy never worked in the county again. Meanwhile, Emma and Marcus had moved in with Brian's sister Catherine after child services got involved. Catherine called me to apologize for her brother and asked if Marcus could visit the workshop because he'd been having nightmares about what his parents did to me. Emma had started writing online about growing up with parents who treated everyone like criminals, and her blog got so popular that companies started paying for ads on it. She sent every penny to groups that help immigrant workers with legal problems. Matt's plea hearing happened the next week, and I watched him stand in front of the judge shaking so hard the bailiff had to steady him. He admitted Brian had spent months telling him that Mexican and black delivery drivers were all casing houses for robberies and showing him fake crime statistics Brian had made up. Matt started crying so hard he couldn't talk when he described how Brian convinced him to keep a bat by the door and check his security cameras every time a non-white person walked by. Linda sat in the back row with divorce papers in her lap and wouldn't even look at him. The prosecutor asked Matt if he understood he'd assaulted an innocent man, and Matt just nodded and said Brian made him so scared of everyone that he'd started following delivery trucks around the neighborhood taking pictures. 2 days later, the police drove me back to the Henderson house to get my tools that got left behind in all the chaos. The place was completely empty with a foreclosure notice taped to the door and weeds already growing through the driveway cracks. Standing in that dining room where Brian had grabbed my wrist and accused me of stealing, where Matt had held me against the wall, where Grace had filmed me like I was some kind of criminal, I could still see the scratches on the floor from when they'd dragged my handmade chairs across the hardwood. The detective pointed to the corner where my tool bag had been kicked during the struggle and said the crime scene photos showed my chisels scattered everywhere like evidence of some break-in instead of the instruments I'd used to create their furniture. I picked up each tool and remembered using it to carve the details Brian had paid $50,000 for, the same details he'd accused me of trying to steal. 4 months after everything started, the prosecutor called to say Brian's former secretary wanted to testify. She came to my workshop with a box of recordings she'd secretly made after Brian grabbed her in his office, and she'd reported it to HR only to be fired the next day. On the recordings, you could hear Brian telling Grace exactly what to say if they ever needed to frame someone, how to cry on command, how to position herself so cameras would catch her looking scared. Another recording had Brian laughing about how he'd planted drugs in a contractor's truck, then called the cops, and how the guy spent 3 days in jail before proving his innocence, but still lost his business. Marcus secretly recording his own father for months makes me really curious about when he decided to start. Was it after seeing other contractors hurt, or did something specific happen that made him realize who his dad really was? She played me one where Brian described sexually assaulting her in detail to another partner who just laughed and said she probably wanted it since she wore skirts to work. The police academy invited me to speak after the video of Brian attacking me went viral and got used in training programs about racial profiling. Sarah introduced me to a room full of cadets and explained how she'd almost arrested me that day because Brian and Grace seemed so believable, so normal, so much like the kind of people cops usually trust. I showed them my hands and the scars from years of woodworking and asked how many times they'd assumed someone was guilty because of how they looked or what job they did. One cadet raised his hand and admitted his dad was a mechanic, and people always assumed he was trying to rip them off just because he had grease under his fingernails. Another said her mom cleaned houses, and the clients would count their jewelry after she left. Grace made bail somehow, and 2 weeks later our security cameras caught her sneaking up to the workshop at 3 in the morning with gas cans. She'd already poured gasoline all over the front door when the motion lights came on, and she tried to run, but slipped in the gas and fell face first into the gravel. The police found her with matches in one hand and a lighter in the other, her face all cut up from the fall, screaming that I'd ruined her life and deserved to burn. They charged her with attempted arson and terrorism since she'd tried to destroy a place where multiple people worked, and the judge revoked her bail immediately. Marcus showed up at the workshop the next week with something wrapped in a dish towel, his hands shaking as he unwrapped a cutting board he'd made from oak scraps. He'd sanded it smooth and oiled it just like I'd taught him during his visits, and he'd burned his initials into the corner with a wood-burning pen he'd bought with his allowance. He said making it helped him understand that creating something real takes patience and skill, not the kind of money his parents threw around to make themselves feel important. He'd gotten into art school and wanted to study furniture design, to learn how to build things that would last longer than his family's reputation. The prosecutor called the next day with news that made everything else look small. Brian had been secretly recording his conversations with a judge and 2 prosecutors at the country club, talking about which cases to throw out and how much it would cost. The FBI got involved immediately and arrested the judge right in his courtroom, dragging him out in handcuffs in front of everyone. They found Brian had paid over $300,000 in bribes to make sure his club members never faced charges for drunk driving, assault, and worse. Our trial got delayed but assigned to a new judge from outside the county who had no connection to anyone involved. James Johnson, the landscaper Brian had terrorized, started coming to the workshop just to talk about what happened to him. Other victims began showing up too. The plumber Brian had followed, the electrician he'd accused of theft, the house cleaner Grace had strip searched. We met every month to share our stories and figure out how to change laws so workers had more protection from customers who thought money gave them the right to treat people like criminals. The group grew to 30 people, and we started a legal fund to help workers who couldn't afford lawyers when rich clients tried to destroy them. 6 months later, I walked into the federal courthouse in White Plains, wearing the same suit I'd bought for my grandfather's funeral, my hands shaking as I passed through metal detectors while news cameras filmed everyone entering. The prosecutor had warned me this would be huge, since they'd found 43 victims over 15 years who Brian had terrorized, threatened, or assaulted, turning what started as my case into something massive. Inside the courtroom, Brian sat at the defense table in an expensive suit trying to look sympathetic, but when the first victim testified about how he'd followed her home after accusing her of stealing cleaning supplies, Brian smirked worked, and the jury saw it. The prosecutor showed security footage from 12 different homes where Brian had done the same thing, following workers to their cars, taking photos of license plates, making threats about immigration even to citizens. Each victim took the stand describing how Brian had grabbed them, searched their belongings, accused them of crimes, and when the prosecutor asked why they hadn't reported it, they all said the same thing about being afraid no one would believe them against someone so rich. On day 3, I spent 6 hours on the stand, starting with the prosecutor having me describe every detail of that delivery day, then pulling out my grandfather's ruined apron from an evidence bag. The leather was still stained with dirt from where Brian had ground it under his foot. The embroidery my grandmother had done torn where Matt had grabbed it, and when I explained how my grandfather wore it for 40 years before giving it to me, 3 jurors started crying. The defense lawyer tried to make it seem like I was exaggerating, but the prosecutor played Grace's 911 call where you could hear Brian mocking the apron in the background, calling it trash while stepping on it. During lunch break, I went to the bathroom and Brian followed me in, standing at the urinal next to mine even though all the others were empty. "You destroyed everything," he whispered without looking at me, "and I'll make you pay for this no matter what happens in here." I walked straight to the prosecutor's office and reported it, and within an hour, Brian was wearing ankle shackles for the rest of the trial for witness intimidation. The judge moved Grace's trial to a separate proceeding after her lawyer argued she was under Brian's control, but the recordings from the coffee shop and her attempt to burn down my workshop destroyed that defense. The prosecutor offered her 15 years if she'd testify against Brian, and she took it so fast her lawyer didn't even have time to negotiate. Grace spent 2 days on the stand revealing things that made the whole courtroom gasp, like how Brian had beaten 2-day laborers he'd hired to move furniture, knowing they were undocumented and couldn't report it. She gave dates, names, even showed texts where Brian bragged about planting drugs in a black contractor's truck to get him arrested when he'd asked for payment on a bathroom renovation. She testified about the spreadsheet Brian kept of every worker who'd ever been to their house with notes about their immigration status, criminal records he'd paid investigators to find, and plans for how to destroy them if needed. Marcus took the stand next, his voice shaking as he described growing up hearing his parents use slurs about every worker who came to the house, being taught to watch them constantly, to assume they were all criminals. His sister Emma testified by video from college about the paranoia in their house, how they had cameras in every room to watch workers, how their mother would count silverware after the cleaner left. Both kids cried, describing how they'd believed it was normal until they got older and realized their parents had poisoned them with hate and fear. The prosecutor brought in Brian's former business partners who testified about racist emails, his refusal to hire minorities, and 3 lawsuits they'd settled quietly when Brian had assaulted employees. An FBI analyst showed Brian's financial records, revealing he'd been claiming the workers he terrorized had stolen from him to write off taxes, essentially profiting from his false accusations. After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury went to deliberate and came back in 4 hours with guilty verdicts on all 43 counts of extortion, conspiracy, hate crimes, tax evasion, and witness intimidation. Brian collapsed when they read the verdicts, and EMTs had to carry him out on a stretcher while the judge scheduled sentencing for next month, warning the minimum would be 25 years, but he was considering life. That night, Thomas brought a bottle of whiskey to the workshop that my grandfather had left me for a special occasion, and we sat among the wood shavings toasting to justice while my phone rang non-stop with orders. We'd received over 200 commissions from people who wanted to support our business, more work than we could handle in 5 years, turning Brian's attempt to destroy me into the thing that made my career. The museum called the next morning wanting to commission an exhibition about craftsmanship and discrimination in America, asking to display my ruined apron alongside the furniture Brian and Grace had rejected. 3 days later, a Hollywood producer called about making a documentary, offering to donate all proceeds to organizations that protect workers from customer abuse, and Marcus immediately agreed to participate, saying he wanted the story to be a warning about how money and prejudice could corrupt entire communities. 7 months dragged by before Brian's sentencing date finally arrived, and I sat in the packed courtroom watching 12 victims take the stand one by one. Eduardo's son Carlos stood at the podium holding his father's written statement with shaking hands because Eduardo had died just 2 days earlier from a heart attack his doctor said was caused by stress. Carlos read how Brian's false accusations had destroyed his father's last years, how Eduardo couldn't find work anywhere after being labeled a thief, how he'd spent his final months crying about losing his good name after 40 years of honest work. The judge actually pulled out a tissue and wiped her eyes while Carlos described finding his father dead in their garage still wearing his work clothes because he'd been trying to start his own lawn service to feed their family. Brian, following Marcus's dad into the bathroom during a federal trial to whisper threats, makes me wonder what he thought would happen in a courthouse full of security cameras and witnesses. When the judge asked Brian if he wanted to speak before sentencing, he stood up and started ranting about reverse discrimination and how this whole trial was a setup to destroy successful white men. The prosecutor had to physically restrain me when Brian pointed at Eduardo's family and said they were probably illegal anyway and deserved what happened to them. The judge sentenced him to 45 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole, and Brian completely lost it, screaming that we'd staged everything and that he was the real victim here. 2 bailiffs had to drag him out while he kept yelling about witch hunts and how his lawyers would get this overturned, and the whole courtroom burst into applause from victims and their families. Grace's sentencing came the next day, and she at least tried to apologize to me directly, though her words felt empty after everything she'd done. Her mother sat in the back row and kept mouthing, "I'm sorry" to me, while Grace got 18 years for her role, plus the arson attempt she'd planned at our workshop. Matt's plea deal hearing was quieter since Linda had already moved to California with their kids and didn't even show up to watch. He got 2 years probation and mandatory counseling, and afterward he actually waited for me outside the courthouse to apologize again, showing what seemed like real understanding of what he'd done wrong. The civil trial took another month, but the jury awarded us $4.7 million in damages, though most would come from insurance and asset sales since the IRS had already frozen Brian's hidden account. accounts. Patricia made sure every victim got compensated, with Eduardo's family receiving the largest share of $1.2 million for their loss. 8 months after the original incident, 2 guys from a white supremacist group called True Patriots got arrested by the FBI for planning to attack our workshop in revenge for Brian's conviction. The community responded by organizing this huge craft fair in our parking lot, with hundreds of people showing up to support us and buy handmade items from local artists. Marcus graduated high school as valedictorian that spring and gave this speech about choosing integrity over inheritance that had everyone in tears. He thanked me publicly for showing him what real strength looked like, and a guard later told me Brian had watched the whole thing on a contraband phone from prison. The Smithsonian exhibition opened that fall with my grandfather's apron as the centerpiece, except it wasn't the destroyed one anymore because Marcus had secretly worked with leather craftsmen for months to restore it perfectly as a surprise. Standing there with Patricia and our kids looking at that apron behind museum glass, I felt something inside me finally start to heal after all those months of anger. But even a year after everything happened, I still jumped whenever delivery trucks pulled up to our workshop, and my hands would shake when unfamiliar people walked through the door. Thomas noticed and installed this plaque by the entrance that said, "All workers welcome with dignity and respect," in 12 different languages, which helped remind me why we'd fought so hard. I kept the furniture Brian and Grace had commissioned in a storage unit across town, and sometimes I'd go there alone just to run my hands over the wood and remember that beauty could still exist, even when it came from the ugliest circumstances. Patricia suggested we auction it for charity, but I couldn't let it go because those pieces represented 8 months of my life before everything went wrong, back when I still believed rich clients were just people who appreciated fine craftsmanship. A year after that terrible day, we opened our workshop doors to hundreds of people who'd been waiting to see where their furniture came from. Sarah arrived first with her restaurant staff, followed by dozens of workers Brian had terrorized over the years, and even Linda showed up after flying in from California, where she'd moved to escape the shame of what Matt had done. The workshop filled with laughter and tears as people shared their stories while running their hands over the wood samples I'd set out, and I was showing a group how to use a hand plane when someone's phone started buzzing with breaking news. The local news anchor on the screen looked serious as she announced that Brian Henderson had been killed in federal prison by another inmate, a Mexican-American man whose brother's landscaping business had been destroyed by Brian's false accusations years ago. Nobody cheered, but the room went quiet as we all processed that Brian's hatred had finally consumed him the way it had consumed so many others. 3 days later, a letter arrived from Grace in prison, her handwriting shaky as she explained that Brian's death had freed her to finally tell everything. She confessed to 17 more cases where they'd filed false police reports against workers, including 3 where people had been deported and 1 where a man had killed himself after losing his green card application. The detective who'd helped me called to say Grace's confession had given closure to several families who'd never known why their loved ones had been targeted. Marcus and his sister Emma used the money they'd recovered from their parents' hidden accounts to start a foundation providing legal help for workers facing false accusations. They named it after Eduardo, the gardener who'd died of a heart attack before seeing justice, and at the dedication ceremony his widow and children stood crying as Marcus explained how Eduardo's story had opened his eyes to what his parents had really been. The foundation's first case helped a construction worker whose employer had called ICE on him rather than pay for his broken arm from a job site injury. 2 weeks later, the governor came to our workshop to sign the new law making false accusations against workers a felony with mandatory prison time. They called it Robert's Law, but I'd insisted Eduardo's name be included too, so officially it became the Robert Miller Eduardo Ramirez Worker Protection Act, and we had 37 workers who'd been victimized standing behind us as the governor signed. The documentary about our case premiered downtown 14 months after everything started, and I was heading to my seat when a man grabbed my arm gently. He introduced himself as Brian's brother James, and instead of anger, he had tears in his eyes as he handed me a stack of letters Brian had written from prison. The letters showed Brian's complete mental breakdown, filled with paranoid rants about Mexican conspiracies and how even the white guards were secretly Hispanic agents, proving his racism had turned into full psychosis before his death. James apologized for not stopping Brian years earlier when he'd cut James off for marrying a black woman, saying he should have known Brian would hurt others the way he'd hurt their family. A week later, we got word that Grace had been attacked in prison by another inmate whose cousin had been deported after Grace's false report. The attack left Grace partially paralyzed from the waist down, confined to a wheelchair in the prison medical ward for the rest of her 20-year sentence. I didn't celebrate her injury, but couldn't ignore the harsh justice in her facing the same vulnerability she and Brian had forced on so many workers. Marcus brought his new girlfriend to the workshop the following month, and my throat tightened when he introduced her as Eduardo's granddaughter Maria, the girl who'd received the scholarship. They'd met at Eduardo's memorial service and bonded over transforming their family's trauma into something positive, and watching them work together on a small jewelry box felt like the ultimate rejection of everything Brian had believed. The FBI agent heading the investigation called to say they'd finished their work with 37 indictments of Brian's network members. The country club where Brian had recruited his conspirators was shut down and seized, its assets liquidated to pay victims, and the building was being converted into a community center specifically focused on helping immigrant families. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that the place where rich white men had planned their attacks on workers would now serve the very people they'd tried to destroy. The final federal trial wrapped up 18 months after that horrible delivery day, with the judge calling it the most extensive hate crime network ever prosecuted in New York. The combined sentences totaled over 400 years in prison, sending a message that terrorizing workers wouldn't be tolerated anymore. And as I sat in the gallery watching the verdicts, I thought about those dining room chairs still sitting in storage. They represented the last piece of my old life, when I'd believed craftsmanship could bridge any divide, before learning that some people's hatred ran deeper than any beauty could reach. Thomas called me 6 months later with an idea that changed changed everything. He wanted to expand the workshop into a school for traditional craftsmanship with full scholarships for minority students. We spent weeks converting the old storage building next door into classrooms with workbenches and tool racks. Marcus showed up every afternoon after his community college classes to help sand floors and install lighting. His hands had gotten steady from months of practice, and he could already identify different wood types by grain pattern alone. We opened enrollment in January and had 40 applications within 2 weeks for 12 spots. The first graduating class finished their training in 18 months, and every single one had job offers before graduation. Marcus started teaching beginner classes while studying furniture design at night school. I watched him demonstrate dovetail joints to a group of new students with the same patience Thomas had shown me 20 years ago. Brian's courtroom meltdown makes me wonder if he truly believed his own twisted version of reality, or if this was just his last desperate performance. Grace trying to apologize feels hollow, but at least she showed some tiny bit of awareness, unlike Brian, who went to his grave convinced everyone else was wrong. One afternoon, I started working on a special piece using wood salvaged from the old country club that had burned down. The table base incorporated fragments of my grandfather's apron that I'd carefully preserved after Brian destroyed it. Marcus helped me with the final oil finish, and we worked side by side for 3 days getting it perfect. The completed table now sits in the workshop entrance where everyone can see it when they walk in. Sarah got promoted to captain and called to tell me she'd implemented new protocols for investigating service worker complaints. Every complaint now required pattern analysis and mandatory follow-up interviews with multiple witnesses. She sent me copies of the new training materials that used our case as the primary example. Her department had already prevented dozens of similar incidents using the new procedures she'd developed. Emma Henderson published a memoir about growing up in her parents' household 18 months after the trial ended. She donated all the proceeds to organizations supporting victims of discrimination and workplace abuse. At her book signing downtown, she read a passage about watching me that day in her parents' house. She described how my calm dignity, while her parents screamed, showed her there was another way to live. 2 years after everything started, Grace died in prison from complications related to her paralysis and prescription drug withdrawal. Emma and Marcus chose not to attend the funeral, but instead organized a memorial for all their parents' victims. They rented a community center, and over 200 people showed up to share their stories. The workshop had become something I never expected, as workers who'd faced discrimination started visiting to leave notes on our solidarity wall. Every morning, I'd find new messages pinned up from delivery drivers and cleaners and landscapers sharing their own experiences. Reading them reminded me daily that our fight had given others courage to speak up about their own treatment. Marcus opened his own studio last spring, specializing in affordable furniture for immigrant families funded by commissions from wealthy clients. His first completed piece was a dining table for Eduardo's widow, crafted with the same 16-coat finish I'd taught him. He delivered it personally and helped her set it up in her small apartment while her kids watched. A letter arrived yesterday from an inmate who'd been Brian's cellmate during his final months in prison. He wrote that Brian had spent those last weeks consumed by paranoid delusions about minority conspiracies even behind bars. The other inmates avoided him completely, and he died alone in the medical wing, still ranting about being persecuted. Standing in the workshop at closing time, I ran my hands over the original dining set Brian and Grace never received. These pieces that took 8 months of my life will never leave this space now. They've become monuments to something more important than their $50,000 price tag could ever represent. Thomas found me there yesterday evening watching Marcus teach a young Ethiopian refugee how to read wood grain patterns. The boy's eyes lit up when Marcus showed him how to identify heartwood from sapwood by color variation alone. My grandfather's restored apron hangs on the wall now beside photos of every worker we've helped find justice since our case. The workshop hums with purpose every day as 12 new students learn traditional joinery techniques alongside modern business practices. We've placed 48 graduates in jobs across the tri-state area with starting salaries above union scale. Justice turned out to be more than verdicts and prison sentences and million-dollar settlements. It's Marcus teaching that refugee boy the same techniques my grandfather taught me 60 years ago. It's watching someone who started as Brian's son become a master craftsman, helping immigrant families furnish their first American homes. It's knowing that every piece of furniture leaving this workshop carries the story of workers who refuse to be silenced. Man, I can't stop thinking about why Thomas popped up last night. The timing was just too perfect to be random. Feels like he knew exactly what he was walking into. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.